Today we'll hear from four different speakers, each focusing on a distinct and separate area of public policy that was enunciated and embedded in the 1972 policy launch. Now, the breadth of that policy platform was dramatic. Not everything can be covered. For example, international affairs, while touched upon today, will have to be more robustly covered at subsequent events throughout the anniversary period. So today we focus on four policy areas. Now, it's my pleasure now to introduce our panelists. In reverse speaking order, if I may I first welcome and introduce Kim Williams, AM. Kim, as you know, has an almost unparalleled career across the arts, entertainment, and media industries. Kim is, of course, a Whitlam Institute board member and will be considering Whitlam's transformational national arts and culture policy, its resourcing, and its enduring national importance from both historical and contemporary perspectives. In 2019, Kim delivered a Whitlam Legacy occasional paper published by the Whitlam Institute entitled Whitlam, Arts and Democracy, which accompanied the opening of the Dedicated exhibition. Incidentally, this exhibition is now on show at the Leo Kelly Arts Center in Blacktown. Dr. Emily Millane, our next panelist, is an expert on superannuation law, history, and policy. Formerly a Grattan of the Grattan Institute, Emily is a policy advisor to the Federal Treasurer of Australia, Dr. Jim Chalmers, MP. Emily will address the Whitlam policy contributions to social security and welfare within a wider historical framework. Dr. Hannah Forsyth in the center is a historian of work, education, and capitalism at the Australian Catholic University. She has written extensively on the histories of universities in modern Australia. Her forthcoming book for Cambridge University Press is entitled Virtue Capitalists: The Rise and Fall of the Professional Class in an Anglo World. Hannah will address the Whitlam's government's policy and policy approach to higher education. Finally, our first panelist is from Senator the Honourable Patrick Dodson, recognized as a living national treasure and warmly regarded as Australia's father of reconciliation. Despite not being able to attend, the Senator was very keen to contribute to these discussions here today. And a few weeks ago, I met with him to record an interview. We will present a 15-minute edited version of a longer interview during which he spoke of his personal connection with Gough Whitlam, the importance of the Whitlam policy reset for First Nations peoples, the legacy of the Racial Discrimination Act, the voice to Parliament, and other issues of Indigenous rights impacted by Whitlam and his legacy. So without any further ado, might I, now that I've introduced the panelists, invite them to temporarily take a seat in the audience so we can now play the video, which will be about 14 or 15 minutes. Welcome, Senator Patrick Dodson, and thank you for participating in session 3, Priorities of the People. When did you first become aware of Gough Whitlam?
Gough Whitlam sort of came like a meteorite into the Australian landscape. It was clear that he was campaigning, he was going to run for Parliament, and I suppose became aware of him vaguely in the background, but then it wasn't until his speech, I think, with its time and the notice that he was going to deal with land rights and that he was about equity and that discrimination on the basis of race were things that really he was basically calling time on, that we needed to do something. So he impacted me greatly by his tremendous oratory, but also his principles. And so it was that early period, and then obviously the election, and then getting into power and the setting up of his first ministry, which is a very small one, which did a tremendous amount of work in a very short space of time. I think he would have been very impressed with the fact that in the background was this debate of assimilation and self-determination, I think, going on with some of the anthropologists that Gough would have been aware of to some degree, but then witnessing the lifestyle, the ceremonial life, the fact that people spoke language, that they had a communal structure to their ways of living, that would have impressed him. And certainly their bushcraft, their intelligence, observation, the skills that people brought to bear to their daily existence would have impressed him, no doubt, of the uniqueness of Aboriginal societies, and not only that, but the uniqueness of the collective nature of those societies through kinship structures. He would have become aware of those terms and the way the protocols work. So, yeah, I think he would have found that quite fascinating and instructive, which I think probably helped form some of his views about equity in the way he went about future policies.
Among the more than 200 commitments set out by Gough Whitlam's remarkable 1972 It's Time policy speech at Bowman Hall was this: "We will legislate to give Aborigines land rights, not just because their case is beyond argument, but because all of us as Australians are diminished while Aborigines are denied their rightful place in this nation." How significant was this fundamental policy shift?
Oh, when Gough came out and said that if elected he would give Aboriginal people land rights, not because it was an act of largesse. I think he acknowledged that, even though he didn't say this, that it was by right and by virtue of the injustice that had been perpetrated upon Aboriginal people by the colonists. And so rectifying that to the extent that legislation could, it was something that he was prepared to do. It was music to our ears at the time, because it wasn't an act of graciousness in one sense, that he was beyond that. He could see the injustice and therefore the need to rectify that as a nation, otherwise we would remain diminished. But it was a breath of fresh air. It was a broom to a dusty room, basically. So he did an enormous amount in a very short space of time. The international standards under the covenants and declarations were very central to a lot of his thinking and his philosophy in adopting policy and programs and strategies to implement them. It was very critical for us as a nation, if we were ever going to be considered a mature, responsible democracy, that we'd need to do something about the treatment that was delivered to Aboriginal people, and that was to recognise them as part of our, not only as citizens, but in a unique sense, as the unique peoples of these lands, and therefore a unique connection to their lands through the form of land rights that took place in the Northern Territory, that he'd proposed, or that he undertook to get done, and obviously Fraser took that mission on subsequently. But Gough was the bloke that was about seeing the big picture, knowing its implications for us as a nation in the international arena, and knowing full well that if we didn't rectify the human injustices that were blatantly obvious, then we would be held accountable, not only in the international courts and international arenas, but in our trading relations as well.
In his speech, he again made mention of the importance that Aboriginal communities themselves must decide both the pace and the nature of the future development of their recognition within the Australian Constitution and society and legislation. Was this a new development in relations with the Aboriginal communities in Australia for a government?
Absolutely. I mean, we'd been impacted by terra nullius, the legal fiction that no one was here, therefore we didn't exist. We'd been impacted by the assimilationist policies that governments adopted to try to change us into something that we weren't into. becoming British colonial settlers. And so the debates were raging in the background between anthropologists of one form or another about assimilation or self-determination. And I think Gough, upholding the tenet from that United Nations covenant, was probably had the foresight that has evolved since as the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. It was a breath of fresh air because we were no one. We were a dying race when they drafted the Constitution, which meant that we had no status, no position in this country. And he made it clear that implicit in our ability to be self-determining that we were a people or peoples. So that was a grand thing to have done and gave us great heart. And we then, obviously, people then advocated a lot more stridently on the streets for our rights, not only land rights, but the right to be able to live in this country in the way we chose.
How important to land rights was the Racial Discrimination Act?
Oh, it's tremendously important. The Racial Discrimination Act was tremendously important. I think because inherent in our Constitution are racist provisions. And that's Section 5126, and there's another section that people could be disbarred from voting in elections. So he understood, I think, as a constitutional lawyer, the inherent racism of our Constitution, and that one way to deal with that inherent matter, which is 5126, is to have a non-discrimination law, have a racial discrimination law, so that if people are attacked by or have laws that are based on race directed towards them, then you'd have some remedy to appeal those injustices through the law, which went back to that covenant you spoke of. So he was very much about the common humanity, I think, of human beings, rather than the ethnocentric, archaic view of race that was implied in the drafters of the Constitution 1901.
If we did not have a Racial Discrimination Act, what of land rights? Would Mambo number 2 have occurred? Would we have had a Native Title Act of 1993?
Probably would not have had it. We probably would not have had a capacity in the law to enable special provisions to be relied upon and exemptions from the discrimination aspects of the law as it was drafted, so that the exceptions or exemptions from that were critical to getting laws passed on land rights, native title, and other laws that were specifically designed for the benefit of Aboriginal people. So he was an engineer in the legal landscape that gave us the capacity in that act to do that without it being offensive to the rights of others in the nation.
Has the Racial Discrimination Act given way underfoot in a fashion which is telling of the Act's limitations? For example, what of the cashless debit card policy?
Well, that to me is an abuse of power, that so-called mutual obligation where the Crown imposes obligations on Aboriginal people as well as on others who are impoverished, but particularly on Aboriginal people, on the basis that it would have a reciprocal obligation, when in fact it doesn't deliver that. So the mutual obligation, which has punitive provisions that impact Aboriginal people in terms of being denied access to the welfare component of the benefits, is absolutely abuse of power. The treaty concept it originates with the lack of an agreement that were part of Cook's instructions to take possession of this land with the consent of the Aboriginal peoples. That never happened, of course. So the construction of the legal fiction, the lie of terra nullius, emanated, and that was brought to truck, I suppose, when the Mabo judgment came into existence. And so the need for a treaty really was the beginnings when the Governor of New South Wales overrode the Whitlam Treaty in Victoria and established this doctrine of tenure. Was only capable of, you could only take land or hold land with the permission of the Crown. And there was no regard for the rights of Aboriginal people at all. But we've known for over 200 years that Aboriginal people have been in possession of this country. There's never been an agreement. There's never been a settling of the injustices that have been perpetrated upon us, and that the only way we've got to go forward is, one, is to recognise the First Nations in our Constitution through a referendum, and then embark upon a treaty-making process with First Nations peoples to try and redress some of those wrongs that were done in the past.
Considering the passage of time, how important was the Whitlam legacy to the current movement to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the Constitution?
Oh, Whitlam's pouring soil into the hands of Vincent Lingiari absolutely pivotal to where we are today. It's clear that the voice to the Parliament, and that voice being embedded in our Constitution, is a critical component for redressing many of the injustices that continue, for the Aboriginal people to have their own representatives, directly engaging with the Parliament, not as a third chamber, but directly engaging, proposing better ways to draft legislation and to adopt strategies and to signal where programs and policies aren't working to the way we would like it. So that would be the first time that we would have an unencumbered voice, if it's in the Constitution, where people can give fierce and straight advice to the government and not be worrying about being dismissed, as we've seen in the past with things like ATSIC and the NAC and the NACC. So this is the one time Australians vote will see an immediate result. What we are being asked to do in this referendum is really begin a process of justice that we as Australians can deliver upon. That is, we can sit down and work our way through those legacies of dispossession and destabilisation and map out a future way in which we can enjoy this country in a unique way, as Gough said to Lingiari, as friends and mates together. We've got a lot to be thankful from Gough for his leadership in this area.
Senator Patrick Dodson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Might I invite Hannah, Kim, and Emily to the podium again? Unfortunately, the Senator is not here to answer questions, but I would appreciate greatly if someone from the floor or a few of you could make some comment at the time we do have a Q&A. But now I want to invite Hannah, then Emily, and then Kim to give an address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Look, I want to acknowledge that we are on Gadigal land, beautiful as it continues to be, and that I came down the mountains this morning from Darugangundadara land, which maybe exceeds this with some of its beauty as well. But I want to express my respect and gratitude to Indigenous people in Australia and internationally who have been working towards anti-colonial ends for many decades now. My first book was based on my PhD about 10 years ago, which was a history of universities, which I'm sure you will all go out and buy very quickly straight after this, right? And so that's partly why I'm here. But I've been working for the last too many years on a book that I've only just finished that is, it's called Virtue Capitalists. It's about a history of the professional class across the Anglo world. It argues that middle-class British people spread throughout empire to administer what was going on and formed a professional class in the process that embedded that middle-class morality into professional work. By performing this professional work, they made it into material economic stuff, and it became the foundation of their class power. I'm mentioning this because in the 1970s, there was a crisis of this virtue that has troubled me for some years, until I came to the conclusion that the reason why there was an economic crisis and a crisis of morality at the same time was because these were not separate things. And as I came to think about what this meant for Whitlam's free education, I realised I had to revise some of my earlier ideas about Whitlam's free education from my PhD. So this is a little mea culpa. It mattered in 1972 that education was free. Free education, in the sense that it was used under Whitlam, was not, using today's language, subsidised. It was free. So I want to explore free education as part of this larger moral watershed. I'm positioning this in the context of the larger moral crisis that was necessarily entangled with the 1970s economic shocks on one hand and global decolonisation on the other. There was some competition for the concept of freedom when Whitlam used it. Under Whitlam, free education meant that tuition was free of fees, of course. But it was not typically described as free in the sense, or it is not by historians, free in the sense used at around the same time by Raewyn Connell, Terry Irving and Rowan Cale, who established a free university in Camperdown near the University of Sydney in 1968. At their free U, knowledge was free, but membership was not. So I want to argue that there's actually something shared between the types of freedom that were embodied in Whitlam's free education and in the free U that ran from 68 to about 73. So I suspect that these shared characteristics, rather than just the absence of tuition fees, underpins the really considerable nostalgia that we feel for Whitlam's education reforms. This nostalgia seems deeper than is warranted if we're only evaluating free education for its effect on student equity, though that was important too. But every time we turn around, somebody says, this changed my life in a way that the metrics don't seem to reflect. So we need to understand what this means. And I suspect that by considering what is free about free education, we can better unravel that deep sense of attachment that I think people rightly hold to Whitlam's reforms. So by the 1970s, the kind of freedom embodied in free education was also competing with an altogether different kind of freedom. This freedom from state interference had been promoted since the 1940s by members of the Mont Pelerin Society, especially Friedrich Hayek. To quote political philosopher Jessica White, Hayek idealised, quote, a moral climate that instills personal responsibility and regards it as just that people are rewarded materially based on how valuable their services are to their fellows. Now, this conservative position was not, at least at the time, incommensurate with state-funded education. In the UK, Lord Lionel Robbins, a key member of the Mont Pelerin Society, had been influential in some of the deplanning proposals that decentered government. But see, deplanning for Robbins also sought to dismantle tariffs, but also actively sought and engineered precarity. So he reckoned that people needed to feel the contingency of the market to know and, obviously fear that the boss might shut down works in Lancaster and reopen them in Japan. Citizens who did not fear their precarity might not work hard enough. And yet, it was also Robbins who was responsible for the considerable post-war investment in higher education in Britain. This not only underpinned the key moment in British expansion in human capital investment, it also reorganised, at least to some degree, British occupation structure, and this was on purpose. The changes to universities, Robbins admitted, would result in something that certainly sounded centrally planned. To quote from the Robbins report, he described the expansion of higher education as a very extensive transformation of the social and economic picture. Similarly, in Australia, it was Conservative Prime Minister Robert Menzies who was responsible for the first significant government investment in higher education. Menzies commissioned the 57 Murray report that set universities up for expansion. Now, unlike Whitlam's later free education scheme, universities under Menzies were organised according to a system of merit. And I'm putting this in inverted commas because it reflects the hierarchy that the same professionals had established in the process of settler colonisation. Scholarships, not free education, were granted to those who the government deemed most worthy of investment. This morality grounded in merit was augmented by old values associated with identifying the deserving poor. Such a model of merit characterised the system of higher education in Australia from 1957 until the Whitlam reforms of 72. And we could probably date it a little earlier, arguably from the establishment of the Universities Commission under Labor in 1942. But today I'm going to just quickly summarise the moral framework that characterised the university in the 20th century up until 1972, then link this to the rise of the professional class, because that's what I've been working on, and it's on my mind. But I'll then outline what I think our received ideas about the kind of social service that free education was providing, and then briefly describe the moral crisis of the 70s to conclude by thinking about what was free about all of this. So the virtuous system of merit governed the establishment and expansion of Australian universities and helped to order social and economic life in hierarchies that we must and have often acknowledged have also been unfair and harmful. And I think that includes the entire hierarchies that consisted of the global colonised world. This was the system that offered charity to a so-called deserving poor, and subsidised education in the form of scholarships arguably represented something similar. Scholarships covered the tuition fees for those who could not afford it, but were awarded on the basis of merit. So they were literally deserving poor, even though in fact not all of them were poor. And in part because the scholarship became a symbol of merit, this made it desirable to everybody as a signifier of achievement. The existence of scholarships still very often makes it seem that the system of merit is working. If people can access education without wealth via instruments that value their merit, then we feel reassured that our moral hierarchy is doing its job. By the 1970s, a large percentage of university students, I think maybe about 60% from memory, were accessing higher education via these scholarship schemes. And this has led historians to think that the move to free education under Whitlam has been much exaggerated as a progressive policy, though I'm going to say that we were wrong, including me. The move to free education is so important. So let's turn to the political economic context. So when I wrote my PhD thesis, I tackled this in a frankly superficial way, which, I was doing my best. I said that unlike 1940s Labor policy, and this is me quoting myself with John Faulkner set the trend here, Whitlam had a, quote, population-based view that slowly but systematically prioritised merit over wealth. Whitlam's vision, by contrast to post-war Labor, was more focused to the individual. Consumers, I argued, citizen consumers, possessed individual freedom to purchase the products they chose. So Australian youth should be free to choose from a suite of educational products, and for this to be a genuine choice, I suggested, education had to be free. Now, I was not intending to mislead anyone, I will say, but I now think I was wrong. Let's hear, instead of from me, from the famous quote from Whitlam's maiden speech. Everybody in Australia is entitled, without cost to the individual, to the same educational facilities, whether it be in respect of education at the kindergarten or tertiary stage or the postgraduate stage. Fees is not central to that, is it? This was about the same educational facilities. Makes me think of some of your latest things, Michelle, actually. This was not about choice. It was certainly not about individualised consumption of government services. This was a way to both fund and think about education that would undermine the inequities that by now many people could see was bound up with the system itself. Whitlam's free education invoked, of course, the 19th century Education League's call for elementary schooling that was compulsory, secular and free. The freedom of that older kind of free education was also about fees, but much more centrally, it was about freedom from the influence of the church or of churches. In that profoundly sectarian moment, freedom from church influence was the necessary foundation of free knowledge. That is, of education free to explore the latest discoveries, ideas and literature. I mean, if only that's what they did, in fact. But still, while schooling tended to be foolishly restrictive, in fact, on students as well as knowledge, at least some focus on freedom articulated the possibility of openness and discovery and becoming. Freedom from religious interference was also a precondition for making schooling compulsory, because you couldn't expect Catholic families, for example, to be happy for their children to be compulsorily attending a school that required them to acquire Protestant beliefs. In the same sense as the old Education League, Whitlam's free education was about free tuition, of course, but in extending free education to universities, it was also about freeing higher education itself from the self-interested moral bounds that were imposed on it by the professional class that established it. Unlike British universities of the previous century, the constraints on Australia's secular universities were not imposed by churches for the most part. But as the professions grew in Australia and naturally saw education as their domain, hierarchical values directly benefited that middle class. The system of merit, which was labelled in the 1970s as the hidden curriculum, as I'm sure many would remember, was built by the professional class in their own image in ways that reproduced their own privilege, often at the expense of Aboriginal and working class peoples and many other migrants as well. In the 1970s, educators became newly conscious of this. Now, they were not alone in rethinking the moral foundation of their profession, which was existential for several of the professions. Engineers, who believed that they had literally built civilization, became newly conscious of their contribution to environmental degradation. Lawyers were observing the ways that they propped up the rich and powerful and established illegal aid and so on. Social workers became concerned that they were failing to address the structures that caused the problems that they encountered, and many sought to actively decolonise their work. Radical or critical versions of the virtues associated with each professional emerged, like radical education and eventually things like critical legal studies. To understand the timing of this, I think we have to consider the global transformations. Since the end of the Second World War, decolonisation was a process that in international institutions like the United Nations dismantled what we might call the colonising gaze. Since the work of professions entangled the moral and the economic into a post-war global order, when the shocks of the currency and oil crises of the 1970s hit the global economy, the resulting rethink of nearly everything was both economic and moral. So this presented a moral shock to the structures governing the professions, including education. It did not come out of the blue. Both economic and moral destabilisation was already evident in the 1960s, including collapsing currency agreements, Vatican II, and the deterioration of the post-war gender order that had limited women's and men's work to separate domains. This, by the way, is why the crisis also produced tensions around race and gender that are mirrored in forms of conflict about power and money and strategic resources, which is a bit complicated for this 15 minutes. But what matters now is that it was also evident in the resonances that people felt towards Whitlam's free education. So to wrap up, I want to think about the question that I think emerges from this. If Whitlam's free education was not about citizen consumption or the right to choose, what sort of freedom does it represent? Might we think about using it now? By conceptualising education as free rather than as subsidised, government interference in the market formed by student choice was minimised under Whitlam in a way that has really not characterised the period since free education has ended, for all the supposed minimisation of government interference. Now that governments might supposedly interfere less, though they do interfere less with the size and furnishings of offices and things, they interfere much more, frankly much more harmfully, with financial incentives for areas of study. Free education was about equity of access, and looking forward, it should still be. But it was also about another kind of freedom, of unbounded opportunity. Just like the Free U near Sydney Uni, Whitlam's free education created possibility. It opened rather than closed universities to new people, not only by actively promoting student equity, but by active inclusivity. This inclusivity was not just about fees. It required a decolonising gaze and dismantled unnecessarily restrictive gender norms. Free education was for everyone, and intellectually it enabled anything. The freedom that free education provided, and which I suspect subsidised education never will, opened knowledge as well as participation, and it connected the inclusivity that equity metrics seek with the possibilities of transformative knowledge. Now, those reforms were incomplete. They did not result in vast improvements in student equity, nor even in the kind of radical inclusivity sought by the Free U. But free education still rightly embodies something that sits underneath the promise of the university and towards which I think we all still yearn.
It was wonderful, Hannah. Hi, Emily Millane. I don't have a book out yet, but if I type fast enough, I might have one out next year on super that you'll all no doubt go buy. Thank you to John and good afternoon to you all. I too would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-panellists and their contributions today. So I come to today's symposium as a student of history, but also as someone who works in public policy day to day. And we public policy folk tend to think in terms of identifying problems to fix. And it was therefore my natural inclination when I was invited to come and speak today to think about the Whitlam government from the perspective of today and to draw parallels with the period of the Whitlam government, of high inflation, of an energy crisis, of a government wrestling with its emergent reality, and to ask what can we learn. But today's symposium, I reflected, actually asks us to do something quite different. It calls on us to reimagine the Australia of the 1960s, the competing visions of the country, and the nascent version of a better society that Gough himself imagined. As Sean Kelly reflected in his Fairfax column earlier this week, there's a sense of embarrassment in terms of how Australians publicly speak about matters spiritual, irreducible. As he wrote, once we talked about politics and their vision. I've just ruined that quote. Once we talked about politicians and their visions. Paul Keating, indeed, when I interviewed him for my thesis, described superannuation to me as analogous to his vision for Barangaroo. Just leave that there. In keeping with today's theme, I want to walk through some of the substantial shifts in social policy that the Whitlam government heralded, how the ground was tilled for social change. On poverty, Whitlam had long advocated a broader understanding of poverty, framing it both as a lack of means and of social poverty. Whereas primary poverty referred to a state of want arising from a simple lack of means, secondary poverty was brought about by what he described as the inability of individuals and families to cope with internal and external pressures created by alcoholism, acute marital discord, and other symptoms of psychological maladjustment. Social policy would no longer be limited to rationing scarcity, but instead planning for abundance. In the 1969 election speech, Gough outlined his vision for welfare and his government's role in it, in which he argued that the great weakness in Australian social welfare is that we rely almost wholly on the provision of cash benefits. Australians should no longer tolerate the view that once governments have decided the level of cash payments, the community has discharged its obligations to those who depend upon the community for their sole or main income and sustenance. He would later write that the ALP had been a prisoner of its own past in its limited view of social policy. And yet there were strands of ALP thinking that had pushed social policy ahead. Whitlam himself noted that with the extension of federal benefits under Chifley in the 1940s came a change of ideology on welfare. And whereas the Lyons government had, he argued, regarded welfare as best maintained through private insurance, the payment of benefits by the Chifley government out of consolidated revenue introduced a significant redistributive element into the provision of welfare in Australia. In fact, redistribution had been part of Australia's first social security payments. As Julie Smith observes, these were financed from progressive taxation and entitlement was not based on prior financial contributions. The design of Australia's 20th century social security system thus acknowledged women as productive citizens who were contributing to building the country's capital. Women received the same old age pension as men. A comment on post-war living standards. Whitlam came to power at a time of flux about the role of the state and living standards. As Frank and Emma have noted in their paper for today's symposium, Whitlam wanted to craft a program that responded to the affluent society while ensuring that it did not result in the perpetuation of public squalor, as some thought was occurring in the US. And this was, of course, part of making Labor an appealing proposition to more of the electorate than its traditional base. In his 1963 visit to Australia, British socialist author and Labor Party parliamentarian and advocate of national super, Anthony Crosland, urged the Australian Party to update its policies and attitudes to define its ideas of equality and social welfare in 1960s terms. This meant a party supported not only by manual workers, but also by the rapidly growing number of white-collar workers. Whitlam and the wider Labor Party had been influenced by the post-war social policy measures of Europe. And Labor came to power with a commitment to abolish the means test over the life of the Parliament, matching the timetable of the McMahon government. Whitlam later wrote that he opposed the means test on old age pensions because of the assumption implicit in the test that pensions were handouts for the so-called improvident poor. This was, he argued, a concept that had no place in a modern and wealthy community. Pension universalism versus means-tested targeting had been a tension in Labor welfareism dating back to the early 1900s, and this was reflected in the maternal allowance being universal, where the age pension was means-tested. Race Matthews, former Chief of Staff to Whitlam, had recalled to me the great conundrum before coming to power of how to liberalise pensions without running into the issues of affordability. And this was where the British concept of a two-tier pension system became appealing, one that had been advocated by welfare economist Richard Downing from the University of Melbourne. Downing had been prominent in social debates, in particular concerning living standards of the aged. His biographer, Professor Nicholas Brown, notes that the elderly represented the most conspicuous area in which the post-war world had to prove its worth, carrying as they did a legacy of hardship and fear, and posing the question of what should be extended to those outside the secure domains of employment, family, and the new prosperity. Following a trip to the UK in 1968, Downing developed a proposal for national superannuation and the abolition of the pension means test. I can't quite imagine going to the UK for good ideas at the moment. A different time. Downing had evidently detected the anxieties of the Australian middle class and increasingly affluent workers about their financial security during working life and in periods without income. Having a standard of comfort that represented some decent fraction of what one achieved during working life represented a significant departure from the Australian idea of pensions being merely protection against poverty. Downing's 1968 proposal formed the basis of the Labor Party's commitment to national superannuation in its 1969 policy platform. In Parliament in March 1969, Whitlam argued that appropriate measures for income maintenance must play a role in the overthrow of poverty. A child endowment was necessary so that the children of today's poor are not to become the poor of tomorrow. And a national superannuation scheme was necessary because, I quote, wealthy modern countries can no longer tolerate the idea that retirement should mean instantaneous reduction in living standards by 1/2 or 1/3 for most people. Few such countries other than Australia now tolerate such a proposition. It was through the advocacy of Victorian MP Moss Cass that Whitlam would meet two of Ronald Henderson's doctoral students, John Deeble and Dick Scotton, presenting their ideas about a national health insurance system. And in 1968, national health insurance was announced as Labor's policy. So to shift from this precursor to power to Labor in government, it seems trite to say that social policy was prioritised by the new Whitlam government, but priorities do matter, and we see it flow through into the administration. In 1972, the government amalgamated the Department of Social Services and the Health Insurance and Benefits Division of the Department of Health to create the Department of Social Security. Bill Hayden was made a senior cabinet minister in the Social Security portfolio. Benefit appeal tribunals were established. And Whitlam, the agitator and the intellectual, wanted the evidence for social reform. Comprehensive national poverty statistics were not available at the start of the 1970s. This was something which Whitlam pointed out at various times in opposition, including matters of public importance, which I think Jenny had mentioned earlier today. Some 90 commissions of inquiry and committees and task forces were initiated during Whitlam's administration. These included the Taxation Review Committee, the Asprey Review, the Committee of Inquiry into a National Rehabilitation and Compensation Scheme, the Woodhouse Review, the Interdepartmental Internal Government Review on Incomes, the Income Security Review, and the National Superannuation Committee of Inquiry, or the Hancock Review. Under the leadership of Ronald Henderson, the Millane Institute of Applied Economic and Social Policy would conduct the first national survey of Australian poverty. The survey was originally commissioned by the McMahon government, but was given a broader set of terms by the Whitlam government to allow consideration of secondary poverty, partial poverty, and the importance of social values. And following the example of the United States, the Henderson inquiry would establish a poverty line to measure living standards and provide the basis for policy reform. And together with this intensive period of inquiry, there's this really intensive period, as we've heard, of implementation in government. So to kind of go through some of these social policies, but by no means cover the ground in full. Introducing common rates for pensions and unemployment and sickness benefits. Extending eligibility for the standard rate of the pension to widow pensioners. Introducing pensions for single mothers and other single women in poverty. Pensions for carers of children with disabilities. And increasing the rate of the additional pension for children to $5 a week. Rate of the additional pension for parents with children. Liberalising the pension means test for those aged 70 and over, a change which Whitlam later described as the most significant in terms of all pension eligibility changes the government had made. Per capita spending on social security and welfare more than doubled between 1968 to 9 and 1975 to 6, with the most rapid growth in spending occurring during the term of the Whitlam government. As Ronald Henderson later noted, the increases to old age and widows' pensions above CPI during this period meant that the absolute living standard of these groups rose substantially. The government would also embark on a program of non-cash benefits, including nursing home benefits, increased subsidies for home care services, and grants to organisations for homeless men and women. And of course, a national medical healthcare scheme. Medibank was introduced in July 1975, and it was done so in the face of opposition by various loud voices, including the health insurers, the medical fraternity, and the coalition parties. Finally, it would be remiss of me not to end with a reflection on national superannuation. Once described to me as Bill Kelty as a sideshow during all the reviews during this period, but the Hancock Committee didn't hand down its report until 1977, and no national superannuation scheme was introduced by the Whitlam government, nor since. There was, as Stuart McIntyre has reflected, an unfortunate collision between the urge towards welfare universalism and the economic realities of the 1970s. But one component of the scheme proposed by the majority of the Hancock Committee is interesting to ponder today, and that is redistribution. For all those whose contributions to the scheme fell below 30% of average weekly earnings, male average weekly earnings, the government would supplement their pension. We have a private system of state-mandated superannuation today, with a regressive system of taxation and where millions of dollars are held in some accounts. Something to ponder, perhaps, to till the ground with in the years ahead. Thank you.
Three years ago, I had the honour to write a paper for the Whitlam Institute, as you heard, entitled Whitlam, the Arts and Democracy. In the approaching 50th anniversary of the election of his government, it's overdue to recall the far-sighted actions of that government and the resonances from its policy decisions. It's important to do so not only because of the inestimable benefits derived, but because of the severity of the decline in funding to Australian artists and cultural institutions seen in the last decade, a decline exceeding in real terms 20% before we even begin to look at justified funding levels. Frankly, Whitlam's comprehensive policy and funding actions still provide an exemplar as to modern reformation. Whitlam's was a commitment which was unprecedented in Australian history, matched only once since by Paul Keating's Creative Nation policy, released in October of 1994. As Prime Minister, Whitlam had self-nominated as the responsible Minister for the Arts, the only Prime Minister to do so, a role he took very seriously and which I had the opportunity to discuss with him on many, many occasions. Gough was not shy to have views. Clearly, whilst Gough is recalled by the older members of the creative profession in Australia with heartfelt conviction, his policy actions are less well known to subsequent generations. Over the next 3 years of anniversary events, the Whitlam Institute is well placed to promote a discussion process addressing the need for renewal in policy objectives and allied funding for national intellectual and creative endeavour. It is necessary to restate the priority intellectual and artistic endeavour should always have in public policy for a confident contemporary nation, especially if this relatively small English-speaking population, metaphorically at the bottom of the world, is to revitalise its international outreach and domestic ambition. As a nation, we need fresh renewal, one which looks outward, not seeking comfort from tired imagery and shibboleths as to what I might describe as the polite arts, so often hankered for by conservative administrations. Indeed, whilst coalition administrations have presided over quite staggering funding declines over the last decade and previously between 1996 and 2008, they have offered no cultural or arts policy for the last 4 elections. Actions speak louder than words. Their consistent aggressive action on policy and funding speaks for itself. Unlike others, Whitlam saw the arts elevated as a centrepiece in the Fresh Election Manifesto delivered on the 13th of November 1972. Culture featured equally with undertakings as to a huge range of policy initiatives of a breadth never seen before. In a political first in our nation, Whitlam spelt out in that speech initiatives designed, and I quote, to promote a standard of excellence in the arts, to widen access to and the understanding and application of the arts in the community generally, to help establish and express an Australian identity through the arts, and to promote an awareness of Australian culture abroad. Perish the thought. In that far-reaching policy, so rich with detail, he went to specifics, saying, "We believe that the existing Commonwealth agencies should be brought within a single council set up by statute. The council will be based on a number of autonomous boards with authority to deal with their own budget allocation and staff. The following boards would be established: theatre arts, opera, ballet, drama, music, literary arts, visual and plastic arts, crafts, film and television, and Aboriginal arts. These boards would have substantial independence and authority to make decisions. Indeed, In their own field of responsibility, they would be the major sources of initiative in policy and in communication with those involved in the arts concerned. We will pass an Act for a public lending right. We will review quotas for Australian television, cinema and book production and encourage a greater participation of Australian creative talent in their production. Radio and television will be transferred from the Postmaster General's Department to a new Department of the Media. All of that was included in the policy speech. Those commitments were all delivered with one exception. Never had cultural policy enjoyed centre stage as a deep political commitment. Never had matters of art and culture been central to the national future and its agenda, allied with other primary policy. This was the stuff of big picture vision, which has provided a source of inspiration and a magnet for attack ever since. Inspiration to artists and the cultural institutions central to Australian creative endeavour. Attack from those who seek to belittle the notion of vision, which expresses bold aspirational goals. Those attacks see vision as a term of abuse, in the same way that liberal is now used derisively in America to diminish and denigrate opponents. Whitlam was an unapologetic big picture thinker. The policy foundation for the commitments to the arts in his November speech reflected years of research and thought. Above all, Whitlam's policy approach was grounded in a firm conviction that artists themselves must determine the policy, priorities, and funding allocation. It was a policy commitment which was rooted in respect for the artist and celebration of creative life as a worthy vocation. Of all the myriad things Gough Whitlam did for Australian culture, nothing at all mattered more than the respect he extended to the creative community. In placing representatives from across the spectrum of creative life in charge of decision-making, he gave confidence and respect towards that community. It was transformed in outlook, aspiration and responsibility literally overnight. To be an artist had value. To work as an artist was valued. The work of artists was seen as central to the nation's future. The time of the artist had finally arrived in the modern purpose of the nation. In the opening of the Arts, Letters and Media chapter of his landmark reference work, The Whitlam Government, he wrote, "In any civilised community, the arts and associated amenities must occupy a central place. Their enjoyment should not be seen as something remote from everyday life. Of all the objectives of my government, none had a higher priority than the encouragement of the arts, the preservation and enrichment of our cultural and intellectual heritage. Indeed, of all the objectives of a Labor government, social reform, justice, equity in the provision of welfare services and educational opportunities have as their goal the creation of a society in which the arts and the appreciation of spiritual and intellectual values can flourish." That's the end of the quote. When Whitlam was reviewing the landscape of the Commonwealth's support of culture, he noted that up until his government, it had been marked by sporadic, disconnected, often flawed commitment from previous governments. He asserted that the policy and structural framework needed to be refashioned in a modern way, with a dedicated intention to invest and build coherently. He wanted to secure a policy pathway which saw beyond the simple injection of additional money, notwithstanding the evident need for an uplift in that funding. So what were some of the actions and how were they transformative? The Australia Council provides a pertinent example. And before going into that example, I should say that I now think the Australia Council is a pretty sclerotic institution, far distant from all I'm about to describe, in a way that is profoundly disturbing and a reflection of a neglect of duty of care on the part of multiple governments. 7 weeks after winning office, Whitlam announced on Australia Day of 1973 the establishment of the Interim Australian Council for the Arts, with the Governing Council under the chairmanship of Nugget Coombs and the 7 boards he had described in the November 1972 policy speech. Creators were appointed as the chairs of each of the artistic boards. In addition, all members of the First Australia Council were named with major power brokers in government stipulated. The heads of the Prime Minister's Department, the ABC, the foreshadowed new Department of the Media and the Department of Foreign Affairs were there, uniting relevant parts of government to implement policy. Further ground change was seen with arts practitioners representing 75% of all appointments to the initial Australia Council. 4 weeks later, the membership of the 7 boards was announced. Unlike today, all the boards had a healthy majority of practising artists or working professionals from the arts. The membership of the boards was remarkably diverse in gender, age, geography and experience. The boards no longer exist. The council has 2 artists and a total of 12 or 13 members. In an absolute first in Australian policy delivery, every one of the 15 members of the Aboriginal Arts Board was an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, representing practising artists and others with advanced skills in diverse disciplines. Needless to say, this had not been the case previously, where appointments and decision-making was confined literally to secret men's business, with the single and signal exception of the remarkable Dr. Jean Battersby, Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Council for the Arts and its then 7 staff from its earlier Prime Minister's Department days. There's a lot of talk about Holt and Gorton and their commitments to the arts. The Australia Council was a derisory commitment. It was a commitment on paper, not in life. Needless to say, this had not been the case previously, with the exception of a forlorn initiative by Senator George Brandis in 2015 to create a so-called National Program of Excellence in the Arts under his personal direction on what might be described as an emperor's pleasure model. The adherence to peer review and arm's length determination of funding has been sustained as a guiding principle since 1973. Sadly, the system does not work now as it was originally intended, with peer review constituting grant decision-making on a high turnover basis with no reliable continuity and little impact on policy determination. The speed of delivery of the new statutory authority of the Australia Council is still remarkable when seen from the distance of 50 years. Whitlam had written to Nugget Coombs, concurrent with the announcement of the interim council, requesting a report on the council's future operation, asking that in doing so, Nugget was to take into account the objectives outlined in the election policy speech. An interim report issued from the interim council in May of 1973, and it opined that the powers of the new council should be used in ways which respect, uphold and promote the rights of artists to untrammelled freedom in the practice of the arts, whereby artists and others active in the arts were prominent in the proposed membership whilst ensuring adequate interests of the public generally. The centrality of Parliament to the policy action was a centrepiece of Whitlam's approach to all matters of cultural policy, as indeed it was to all policy, something which is so frequently misrepresented. In other initiatives, 1975 saw a new statutory authority, the Australian Film Commission, created. The AFC incorporated the work of the Australian Film Development Corporation and Film Australia and the former creative branch of the former film division of the Australia Council, which now Film Australia then for the first time enjoyed statutory independence from its creation 30 years before as the Commonwealth Film Unit. Following a tariff board review, a precursor to today's Productivity Commission, for those of you not familiar with some of the precursors, in 1972, the AFC was authorised to extend support not only to the financing of film production, but also, as set out in a very broad-ranging purpose in the Act, to encourage whether by the provision of financial assistance or otherwise, the making, promotion, distribution and broadcasting of Australian programs and to promote and distribute any other programs. It supercharged Australian film and quality television production, especially when married to the new Australian content requirements introduced as conditions on radio and television licensees. The key point is that Whitlam aimed to take a holistic approach to policy execution and not to do things in the previous drip fashion, only halfway responsive to already identified needs. This often amounted to an announcement with limited, if any, follow-up action, seen in previous governments' commitments with poor follow-through, for example, on a film and television school. There was no initiative to actually establish the body, and the Australian National Gallery, which is just a place of perpetual internal dispute, with no building, no commitment to a building, no commitment to an acquisitions process. Both institutions were confirmed and funded by Whitlam, with the film school legislation being passed in early 1973 and opened by him at interim premises in the same year. The Australian National Gallery building was commissioned, a new council and director chosen, an art acquisitions committee appointed, which famously and controversially acquired Pollock's blue poles at arm's length. As promised, the public lending right was legislated for authors in 1974, and in doing so, Whitlam invoked, as I think Frank or Jenny mentioned, he used the example of Canada and New Zealand, which already had public lending rights for authors' books in public libraries. Funding action was boldly transformative for creative life. The ABC had a 50% increase to cover the costs of more Australian content, new FM services, and the advent of colour television, both of those having been, of course, Whitlam government initiatives, although they'd been put off for the previous decade. The arts had a 100% increase in initial funding and further increases in subsequent years, and a vibrant policy landscape emerged with several major reviews intended to reset policy on libraries, museums and other collecting institutions, including, as Frank mentioned, the Australian Archives. The irony of the archives so virulently opposing Jenny's access to the materials from the archives when Gough Whitlam is the only Prime Minister who has been an ardent defendant and promoter and carer about having real duty of care towards the Australian Archives. It's not lost on me. These are but some of the examples, because of the time limits, of cultural policy in the life of Whitlam's government, which was to live but 3 short years. However, solid evidence clearly demonstrates that the resonances from that time and through the arts, through education and many primary cultural institutions, that its impact endures. Long after the torments his government experienced have been placed in context and better perspective, although shrill, invariably determinedly coloured, frequently inaccurate commentary is still more common than not, the real legacy is secure. It was a government which delivered a national cultural policy reset of profound importance. The policy issues affecting intellectual and creative endeavour now, or rather the absence of real policy and consequential underfunding, require urgent attention. They've not been addressed effectively for over 25 years, a long time in the modern aspirational life of Australia. This strange inability to confront evident deficiency occurs when the need for serious increased investment in artistic, thought and knowledge-based endeavour has never been greater. Whitlam still provides a shining standard of substantial reform.
Thank you so much, Kim, Hannah, and Emily. I found it very obvious when we put this program together, the linkage between each of these areas, the areas of equality, morality, democracy, that links each of these distinct policy areas. Might I ask one question, and it might combine a few of you in the response. Emily, of course, referred to Sean Kelly's recent column in which he spoke of a sense of embarrassment in terms of how Australians publicly speak about irreducible and spiritual matters, writing, "Once we talked about politicians and their visions." Now, Whitlam, of course, drew a link between arts, culture, the quality of our democracy. Reinforcing this point, it might be argued that arts, and in particular literature's capacity to model social and political realities and future probabilities, is key to democracy. A political concept centralizing or centering debate and exchanges of opinions and ideas. Now, literature allows us to explore social individual levels of consciousness and how to respond to large-scale changes in the world. So Kim, first, if I might, has the devaluation of the arts, the lack of funding, impaired our capacity for critical thinking and for self-reflection on political and moral issues?
I think it's difficult to exaggerate the dramatic nature of the impact Whitlam had on public policy and direct funding in cultural affairs, whether that was for institutions such as the National Library, an institution he felt particularly passionate about, the Parliamentary Library, which he was equally passionate about. In fact, I remember meeting the Parliamentary Librarian some years ago and saying, "I bet I know your two biggest users." And he said, "I bet you do too." I said, "In the past, Gough Whitlam, and presently Barry Jones." And he said, "Absolutely, by a factor of 20 to 1. Or whether it was in direct funding to artists. Everyone has forgotten how much happened. In the first full year of the operation of the Australia Council, not only did the council grow in terms of professional staff, but the number of creative fellowships that were issued was simply staggering. In literature alone, there were over 100. In composition, Australian composition, which had had some limited, basically face presenting policy from Gorton under a body called the Advisory Board Commonwealth Assistance to Australian Composers, which had the unfortunate acronym in cultural affairs of CAC. The funding to composers was increased dramatically, and composers could actually seriously contemplating working as composers. And there were something like 50 commissions and 20 fellowships issued to composers to live and work as composers. From that time, Australian composers, for the first time, catapulted into the thinking of Australian music institutions, Australian broadcasters, and internationally in multiple jurisdictions. You know, at the same time that I was advocating for Peter Sculthorpe to receive a state funeral, which Tony Abbott refused, saying that Peter Sculthorpe was not a person of the same social status as Dame Joan Sutherland. For those of you who don't know the work of Peter Sculthorpe, he is our most outstanding composer. He got obituaries in Le Monde, in the New Yorker, in the New York Times, in all the British newspapers, in all the major European publications, and across Asia and Japan. I mean, it was a staggering moment, but all of that had come about through the injection and the investment and the allied policy framework which was created by Gough Whitlam. At arm's length, through empowered action at the various boards inside the Australia Council. Of course, Australia has been pauperised in that process, and people have become very much more conservative. These things are pernicious. The number of fellowships issued to Australian writers now is about 4 annually. The number of fellowships issued to composers is 1 or 2. I think it's 1. It's the Don Banks Fellowship, if it's a composer that year. The denial of funding to primary creators in Australia is at its zenith presently. And that has a dramatic impact on the ambition for the society. It has a dramatic impact on the ambition of expectation on the part of audiences. It has an impact on the size of productions. I just got back from London this week from work that I was doing there. And last Saturday I went to see a production of The Crucible at the National Theatre. There were 28 people on the stage. I mean, it was a staggeringly great production. It was an in-your-face production, and it was so relevant to now. You couldn't contemplate having 28 people in any reliable way on an Australian stage now. I mean, things are in a seriously bad way. So the contrast between then and now, and I know I've gone on for too long, is pronounced. My wife's waving her head.
I will take the liberty of taking 7 additional minutes, so I'll eat it partly into our break because I don't want to leave this passion untapped further. But maybe I can follow up on what Kim said and also maybe invite Hannah to comment, because Kim talked about Whitlam's policy around grounding in the conviction that artists themselves through a process of peer review must determine the policy and priorities in resource allocation and funding that was to be provided. In academia, so I want to get Hannah to jump in here. This has long been known as the Haldane principle about peer review in terms of merit. Now, the ARC make recommendations to the minister, but past governments have refused those recommendations based upon a denial of the merits of the work, stating that the work is also must be unmeritorious but absurd, and injecting themselves in that way. Now, this might be an issue of left and right, but how do we escape our echo chambers of that left and that right and assure a multitude of artistic and literary platforms framed around different values so as to access different perspectives on controversial issues?
Well, that's just a simple problem for me to solve in the next 2 minutes, right? Look, things are pretty shit, aren't they? We're sitting on the cusp of major political, economic transformations globally, climate collapse, problems are everywhere. And instead of setting our universities up to think as big as possible and as widely and as creatively, we have these relentlessly closely managed metrics that are there to guide you into whatever somebody who doesn't know anything about it wants to do. I appreciate why perhaps letting academics, who are not the most modest people in the world, run everything seemed like a bad idea. But geez, whatever we've done now is not getting the job done. I'm in the middle of editing a global history of higher education for the 20th century. And you think about the things that higher education has done to decolonise, to make major transformations in South Africa and South America and things. And we should be setting these places up to do this. And instead we're sitting on the cusp of change and doing the exact opposite. So, look, I appreciate that some of those things have come about accidentally, sometimes out of goodwill, but I think it's time to tear them down and build them up again.
Thank you, Hannah. I'll just ask one more question of Emily and then go to the floor for additional questions. Now, this is a point that was made by Frank, by Jenny, by Michelle, by Patrick, and others already this morning. But Whitlam, of course, was an agitator. He was a deep intellectual. And he had that fervent desire to seek the evidence to support his social reforms. He was critical of the ALP history of welfarism, and he wanted to discover the root causes of poverty. In his 1,071 days in office, he launched over 90 commissions of inquiry, committees, task forces. Although unrealized, the Labour Party commitment to a national superannuation scheme in its 1969 policy platform focused upon maintenance of living standards as opposed to securing relief from poverty. Now, how integral to the Whitlam era social security policy were the intellectual exchanges between those people you mentioned, Richard Downing, Professor Ronald Henderson, and finally the chiefly British sources?
Bit of ground to cover there too. They were critical, and it's not to say that there weren't tensions between them either. Ronald Henderson, I think, was quite critical of the Hancock Inquiry's approach to welfare. Henderson's view was of welfare based on need, and the Hancock Inquiry was, at least in part, looking at welfare based on contributions, so a kind of social insurance model. And indeed, these kind of tensions in social welfare policy dated, as I mentioned, back to the 1900s, and the tension between universalism versus means testing. But I think in all these exchanges, and I'm thinking particularly of Downing and his speeches throughout the 50s and 60s, there was no poverty of imagination. And he was an economist, he was an evidence-based person, and we do evidence-based policy now, and that didn't preclude him from thinking and writing and speaking in terms of imagining what dignity looked like. And it does strike me from the standpoint of public policy making today that we tend to work back from, thinking about the budget next week, how big's the deficit, what's the tax spend compared to, as a percentage of GDP, and is it 24 or 24.5, rather than how do we want people to be, and not just be, but what are the ambitions for them and for the country. And so it strikes me that we need to return to a bit of that and to kind of till that ground.
Thank you. I do want to take one and possibly two questions from the floor. Can anyone have a hand? Well, thank you. Una Corbett in the over there.
Hi, I'm Una Corbett. I had a question for Dr. Forsyth, if that's okay. I wondered if you might speak a little more about how this concept of free university, not just fee-free, but sort of boundless, no meritocratic hierarchies, came to bear on gender specifically, both how it changed women's experience of higher education at the time and how changes since then might be affecting women's experience of higher education today.
Gosh, just like that. The hierarchies that were being instilled early in the 20th century were being done with mostly goodwill, right? So that women were setting up their own professions as well, and they were bringing what they thought were their unique, special, womanly virtues into the thing. But it's just that over time, that those became embedded and became the foundation of hierarchies that then influenced pay gaps, that influenced all sorts of types of social standing, but also influenced hierarchies of knowledge, so that characteristics that had traditionally been ones that professional men established as in their professions became more highly valued than the virtues that women brought to their professions. Right now, so then in the 1970s, when it became evident that those virtues were a bit rubbish, kind of purity and courage and temperance and prudence, and these just all seemed a bit silly. So you're starting to turn them upside down, but not everybody wants to do that. And so we kind of end up with this two-tiered system, one where everybody's trying to turn the system upside down, others where the system is being maintained. And those masculine values still stay at the top of the hierarchy that's being valued. And so if we think about a discipline like philosophy, where women should be excelling, they've hardly got any. And the highly masculinized values that they continue to see as being the most valued, hardest type still are dominated by men, and that happens not because women are not good at logic. That's like, it's just that the whole thing builds a culture around it that continues to be perpetuated, and that's just really hard to undo. I think we're working on it, but it's because we simultaneously trying to invert the system of merit and maintain it. It doesn't happen easily.
We have another question up front, Elizabeth Evatt.
A comment I'd like to make to take us back to a point made by Senator Dodson earlier on. I remember very distinctly how Gough Whitlam always said that he was anxious at all times to introduce international human rights standards into Australia. But while he was in government, the only major international human rights convention in force was the Convention on Racial Discrimination, and he ratified that. And he passed the Racial Discrimination Act. And then that allowed Eddie Mabo to challenge the attempt by the Queensland government to abolish land title rights. And hence, the Mabo case was allowed to happen. I just wanted to reinforce that message to make it clear just how important that was and how Gough's commitment to international human rights led to that result. Thanks.
I'll ask another question if I might. It's about, again, Whitlam drawing a link between arts and culture and the quality of democracy. I recognize that there was the issue of the population of the Arts Council membership. And what, Kim, can I invite you to talk to that further? What can be done? What do you expect to be done to repair the original vision and to build an original vision of Whitlam?
Look, in invoking the model from what Whitlam did, I'm not saying that we should revert immediately to an Australia Council designed in 1972, 72, 73 at all. What I am saying is that there are examples of empowerment in that model in terms of putting artists, giving them the responsibility and the empowerment to make policy decisions, funding decisions, and determination of the direction inside their art forms is a good thing. And by artists, I have a broad definition of artists. I mean, professionals who are engaged in the practice of theatre, actors, directors, writers, and so forth. To have them being in the majority on such decision-making processes and to have continuity so that policy is not something that lands from on high, but in fact emanates from a process of responsible discussion between people who are treated as working professionals that have legitimate interests at the table is a very good model. It happens to be implied in most of Europe. I mean, nothing particularly original about it. What was original about it is I guarantee you that Gough Whitlam was the only parliamentarian at that time who knew the European models.
Right, does anyone like the final word, or shall we let Kim have the final word? Sorry, Professor Marigout? No? No, we'll have, that is the final word. But thank you very much to each of our panelists. Thank you.